Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to our two-day Bridging the Gap program sponsored by the Young Lawyers section and our Committee on Continuing Legal Education of the New York Bar Association. Our first program topic this morning is project management for lawyers. Joining us this morning, we are very pleased to have Sarah Gold. Sarah Gold is the founder of the Gold Law Firm in Albany, New York, where she works with small for-profit and non-for-profit businesses to help them with their legal issues. She has also created the Gold Pierce Consulting Group, where she helps small and solo law firms have the right technology and processes in place so they can focus on the practice of law. She is extensively involved with the New York State Bar Association. She, starting June 1, will be the chair of the Law Practice Management Committee. She is also a fellow of the New York State and the American Bar Foundations. She's been the chair of the General Practice section, the chair of the Young Lawyer section, the chair of the Business Law section. She is also the chair of the Solo and Small Firm Committee of the Albany County Bar Association. Sarah is very involved with the New York State Bar Association. She's a fabulous presenter. She's a frequent presenter on our law practice management topics. We are very pleased that she's here with us this morning to kick off our program on project management for lawyers. Without further ado, please welcome Sarah Gold.
Hey everybody. That's exhausting, by the way, that bio, like, holy crap. So it's the beginning. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. So hopefully I don't bore you to tears in the first one. My name is Sarah Gold. I have my own practice here in Albany, New York. I've had my own practice now for 11 years, and I live with an engineer. So for those of you who are familiar with the engineering people, they think differently than you and I. For those of you who've actually had other jobs and being a lawyer, you will understand this, but over time, I've come to appreciate how engineers think, and they are very system driven. They really think out their processes, and it's come to me as a solo practitioner that there is definitely value in this, and this is kind of where this project came out of. Project management for lawyers. First that. All right. So when I really started kind of getting granular about my practice, I started looking at things that I do on a regular basis. And I came to the conclusion that those would be considered workflows. So when we're looking at project management, we want to be able to identify those things you're doing every day, or most days, or that you're doing the same pattern of things over and over again. And when you identify those workflows, it makes it easier to try to identify how to handle them in a more systematic manner. It's important to understand that, when you're first starting down this road, it can be extremely overwhelming, because you're like, well, I do all this stuff and I do it all the time, and where do I start and all that. Don't try to take on everything at once. That will frustrate you, and it'll stop you before you even start. So take kind of the, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, things that kind of annoy you because you have to do them all the time, because those are probably the ones that'll be best used to try to process map. What's process mapping? You're trying to understand how you do your work. And some people go all in and try to do it digitally right out of the box, and that's great, but don't think you have to. A lot of times it can be, for those who are kind of more visual people, you can actually put it on paper. In fact, a lot of people put it on paper first and then ultimately move it to digital. But the problem here is, regardless of what system that you're using, you need to identify all of the steps. And you'd be surprised when you first start doing this, how many steps it takes to do even some basic stuff. And it's really important you don't skip them, because, in your brain, it's kind of automatic. Well, then you would do X, right? However, keep in mind, you're trying to figure out if you ever had to hand this off to somebody else. And that's kind of like the end game here. You're creating a process structure that could be interchangeable with anybody. So if you can figure out how you do it, it's really easy to just, if you're thinking about it as handing off a piece of paper to somebody and saying, could you do this? You want to make sure all the steps are in there, because you don't want somebody to get to like step 5 and go, well, wait a second. How do we get from step 5 to step 6? It's like building a piece of IKEA furniture, right? IKEA furniture doesn't have any written instructions, but the pictures explain it all. If you then go and build some other type of furniture that doesn't have those pictograms, it can be extremely frustrating. Why? Because a lot of times they make certain assumptions in that instruction process that shouldn't be there. So you end up going, wait a second, I'm supposed to do what now? When you do the process mapping right, you don't have that issue. So, and also when you're laying this out, you start looking at where the problems are. You know, what parts of the system are problematic, either because they're extremely complicated or because there's always some sort of stumble. You're waiting for a client to get you information, or you're waiting for somebody else to do something. What are those stress points, friction points in the process? And sometimes those are what you really need to target, but you won't know that until you kind of lay it all out. So here's some basic workflows for a lot of attorneys. And mind you, I'm talking about this as a solo, but these same kind of things work for anybody, whether it's a larger firm, a not-for-profit, a regular company. But for me, these were the ones that kind of jumped into my head when I started looking at like what are basic workflows for most attorneys. The biggest one is client intake. If there's a way you can streamline and automate client intake, it not only makes you money, it keeps your clients happy, and it takes a lot of stress off your plate, because you're going to be spending most of your time working to try to get the client to where they need to be. You shouldn't be spending a ton of time on the intake part. And a lot of times attorneys aren't doing the intake. It's your staff that's doing intake. And that's fine too. But you're going to want to work with your staff, if that's the case, to figure out exactly how that intake is taking place, because you want that same experience for every one of your clients, and you want that experience to be a good one. So by identifying what that workflow is, it goes a long way to kind of standardizing an intake process. Client onboarding is kind of the next step. Depending on your type of practice, client onboarding can be extremely document intensive. It could be a lot of hand-holding. A lot of times your clients, this may be the first time they've ever worked with an attorney. So it's important to make sure that you get the information you need from your client and ask for it only once. So knowing what you need when you need it right out of the box goes a long way to making the client feel as if you know exactly what you're doing. And to be fair, I know even as an attorney who's been out for too many years now, there are days where I don't feel like an attorney at all. But you can't show that to your client. Your clients are relying on you to do the thing, whatever that thing is. And client onboarding goes a long way to making them understand that, yes, I know what I'm doing. I am an attorney. So client onboarding can be a nice target here too. Once you get your clients on board and you got all the information, this is probably for me, one of the biggest issues, matter management. I'm a transactional attorney by trade. So managing matters, it's sort of like herding cats without the people. You want to keep track of who's doing what do you need, when do you need it, what are you waiting on? And for me, I think it's the biggest friction point, because I'm always afraid that something's going to slip through the cracks. If you've got 20 or 30 clients working at once, you need to understand, not everything's going to be hot all the time. And that's great. But you don't want something kind of slip through and get forgotten about, only to have the client come back to you 2 or 3 weeks later and going, what's the status on my case? I spend a lot of time telling my clients what the status of their cases are. And it can be problematic, because for me, at least during COVID, and even now, I do a lot of waiting. I'm waiting on agencies. I'm waiting on the IRS. I'm waiting for things to come back to me. And some of it's within my control, certainly. A lot of it's not. And for me, knowing where the status of files are at any given moment saves me a lot of stress and aggravation, because I can tell my clients immediately, don't worry, we're on this. It might be 6 weeks out, it might be 8 weeks out, or worse yet, let me follow up with XYZ agency because we haven't heard from them in a while. And to be fair, I spend way too much time doing that. Things I refer to going into the black hole, whether it's Department of Education or Secretary of State's office. There's been a lot of agencies that are now months behind. So matter management for me is probably my biggest bugaboo, to try to get my arms around it, because it gives me the most stress, far more so than client onboarding and client intake. I've got those pretty much down now, but matter management, depending on your amount of work that you're doing, can be really problematic. Obviously, you're not going to get paid unless you bill somebody. Billing should be easy. For a lot of people, it's not. It can be because you don't have a good system in place. It can be because you don't have a good way to contact your clients to get them the bills. There are still plenty of firms that do the, pre-bill, approve the pre-bill, create the bills, print them out, mail them out, wait for the checks to come in. I haven't sent a paper check in at least 10 years. I do all my invoices electronically, which you would think would be a lot easier, and it is. But you still got to generate the bills, because if you don't generate them, they're not going to pay you. So sometimes for me, as matter of matter management, I make sure I have steps in there to make sure that when the, whatever that project looks like gets to a certain point, I'm cued to generate the bill. For a lot of you who do retainer work, it's even more important, because you already are holding the money, but you don't have the money for yourself. So you have to make sure that you're generating the bills to let your clients know that you're drawing off the retainer, because obviously you can't just hold your retainers forever, and you still want to get paid too. So billing can be really problematic for a lot of people. And the last one is kind of a throwaway, file closing. You're like, well, what's the big deal in that? You'd be amazed when you're in the thick of it, how often this one slips through the cracks. You get done with the project and you go, oh yeah, we're all good. The bill's been paid, yada, yada, yada. But for a lot of times, the status in your system may still be listed as open. So instead of showing, how many clients you currently have open, you may have, a dozen open and a dozen closed, but everything looks open to you. Which, on paper, that looks great, but, in your mind, it can be extremely cluttered. I made a goal for this quarter to go through all of my current files that are listed as open in my system and actually touch each one of them to see if they're truly open or whether or not they need to be closed out. Because it's something that I tend to, it's one of those things out of sight, out of mind, but at the same time too, I actually have them categorized as open, closed, or pending. And if I can get those into the closed category, it gets them off the table in the open category, which for me, I'm kind of a visual person. It makes a lot more sense to me. So when you're doing this kind of work, what are your goals? And you should have a goal. You shouldn't just go into this because somebody said you should. Each of your workflows works towards a goal. Just generally, even if you weren't doing a system, each of those finite steps that I just mentioned has a goal in mind. Client onboarding, you're trying to get the client into your system and at the same time setting your client's expectations. The second part of that is actually far more important than the first. The first part's easy, whether it's, data entry, your secretary's doing it, you're doing it, whomever, and making sure you have all the documents you need to do the work. The biggest part is the second, setting client expectations. Whether or not you're doing a phone consult or having them in your office, they are going to be asking you questions about what they're going to expect out of the process. For a lot of it, I say, for a lot of clients, this may be their first contact with an attorney ever. They have no idea how the system works. So you want to make sure you identify for the client what you should be expecting throughout the process. If you're planning on contacting them weekly, let them know that. If they're not going to be hearing from you for 2 or 3 weeks at a rip, let them know that too, because a lot of times, this is the only thing on their mind. And they get upset about it, even if it's not necessarily something they need to get upset about. So making sure that the workflows, beyond the standard system also include what the client is looking at as well. It's a mistake to take the client out of the equation, so to speak, when you're doing this kind of project management. And keeping in mind too, if you're having that conversation with the client, find out what their goal is, because you'd be surprised. It may be different than what you think it is. You may be going into this thinking, oh, XYZ, they want me to do this, and at the end of the day, it's going to look like this. Well, if you run that same scenario past your client, they're like, well, no, I need, not only do I need that, but I also want to be able to do this afterwards. Well, if you hadn't asked that question, you'd never know that answer. I'm always sort of surprised, even in like basic formation work that I do all the time. Sometimes when you ask that question to a client, the answer that you get may not be at all. And I've had it where it's like, okay, I'm expecting to form an LLC for somebody and it should be relatively straightforward. And they go, oh yeah, but once we can do this, then I want to do X, Y, and Z. And it might be more work for you too. So, don't overlook that step. This is maybe just the beginning of the relationship. They may have a lot more in mind, but you got to get them over that first hurdle first. It's kind of like a probationary period where you are doing work for them. They kind of feel you out, but they've got a lot more on their brain as far as what they want to do after that. And if you work with them well, that work is yours. So the easiest way to do this kind of systematic understanding is checklists. And when I created this slide originally, I had done this checklist a number of times. I'd done it on paper. Excuse me. I had done it in Microsoft Access at one point. I was trying to, create the best thing to be able to identify where we were in the system. Even having done all that, when I went to do this checklist, I was surprised how many steps there were. And I'm thinking, man, I've been doing this for so many years. How did this get so complicated? But when you really start drilling down to what the steps are, like I said, don't skip the steps. I went back in, I was slotting additional stuff in all over the slide, because it's one of those like, okay, yeah, the basic stuff, get the client contact info, create the filing. Well, even between first one and second one, for me, a lot of that involves waiting for the client. Did the client come up with a name? Was it a good name? Is it a name that can be used? To be fair, I might even have put additional steps in here that I've left off in that process of kind of feeling out what that name looks like. Creating the filing's easy. Filing with department stays easy. Depending on what it is, that between filing and forwarding is instantaneous. Sometimes it's weeks because you have to fax something in. Instruct them on an EIN number. For those of you who are in the transactional world, that's probably a really important part. But, a lot of times, sometimes some of it is pretty straightforward because my clients are previous business owners, but sometimes there's a lot of explanation here. What's an EIN number? How do you use it? Is it expensive? Do I need one? What do I do with it once I get it? Or better yet, I already have one. Can I use it now? And the IRS is kind of a weird sort of creature. So there's a lot of explanation that can be drilled out of this. Setting up the publication, relatively straightforward. Creating an operating agreement. Well, this step here depending on who's all involved, can be extremely complicated. I only made it one step here, but if I've got a multi-member LLC, creating an operating agreement, you may be in this loop for 2 or 3 weeks because you're going through iterations of the operating agreement, talking to the client, understanding what they're looking for and what I refer to as the parade of horribles, as far as what that LLC is going to look like if something were to happen to any of the parties. A lot of times this one gets overlooked, and it kind of kills me because it's what I call the rules of the road for the business, but people tend to overlook that. Notice I put invoice client in that list because if I don't put it in there, it doesn't automatically get done. Where that invoice hits there is because I don't necessarily need to wait for the publication receipts to come back if the publication's already been set up. Normally it's a 6 to 8 week process to get those receipts back. Given the delays at the Secretary of State's office, I literally just had a set of receipts come back for a filing I did at the end of last year. It's May. And the service that I use was like, we were kind of blindsided, but just how bad it had gotten as far as delays were concerned. Client expectations, they're like, where the hell is it? And you're like, it's coming. I just got to wait to get it back. And then the big one that when I did this entire list, things kind of pop into your brain, oh, should I be doing X? Should I be doing Y? For a lot of my clients that I do formations for, it's kind of a one and done. But how best to recontact your client in the future, they have to do biennials. Biennials are every 2 years. The Department of State pretty much kind of puts out the call like, hey, are you still a thing? And it's a cheap filing, but it's a really good way to get back in contact with your client to make sure everything's copacetic. Do you need anything from me? Let me handle your biennial for you. It's kind of it's a loss leader for me. You're only charging, maybe $25-$50 to make sure everything's okay on their end. But they're happy to have it off their plate. And a lot of times it starts that conversation again, like, oh, yeah, I've been meaning to ask you. It's one of those things like you're not at top of mind for them anymore until you are. So putting that kind of thing in is not only just a good thing to have, it's also kind of a marketing sort of piece. So it's kind of interesting how often that happens for me. But like I said here, checklists are complicated, and they are more complicated than you think they are because you think it's a pretty basic process. My original checklist for an LLC was probably 6 steps. This one is, and like I said, there's still more stuff I could throw in there if I really, really wanted to. If you want to get super granular, and like I said, if I handed this to somebody who's a non-attorney or a staff member, they may or may not have questions about what those steps look like. Why do you do this, right? A number of reasons. The big one here is, can you identify redundancies? And while it wasn't apparent in that checklist I just provided you, there are certain processes that I've come across where you start doing things and you end up looping back onto yourself, or you're doing the same step over and over again. That's kind of a problem because you should be able to trim that out if you can do it right. The best way to identify this, though, is to figure out what the steps are. If you don't know, you're just doing it kind of out of rote, you may not even realize that there are redundancies to be had, which, is fine. But, if you start having your staff do it, they may find it really, really boring, which, to be fair, some law work is really, really boring. But if you can identify some of the redundancies, you may be able to figure out a way to either not necessarily skip the step, but figure out if there's another way to automate it so you're not having to do the same thing over and over again. The biggest one here, can you recreate the action from these instructions? I'm not saying you got to figure out, can a 5-year-old do it? Because you're a lawyer. There's some sort of, elevated skill here. But if you hand it off to your spouse or, somebody who is somewhat familiar with the process, and you have them take a look at it. Could they actually do the work? If they can, you probably did it right. Can be reused as a training material or a refresher. Now, this is where it's really come in handy for me. And for a lot of people too, in like transactional world, it may mean it's something you're not doing every day. You may do it like once every 6 months. How many times have you gone to try to do something you haven't done in a while and you're like, wait a second, how do I do this again? Especially if it involves software, it's, what kind of, keyword do you got to use? What kind of process do you have to do? Do you have to download something first and then reprocess it? The one that I actually did for a system that actually worked for me actually had nothing to do with the law. I also teach at RPI. I teach business law and ethics. And at the end of every semester, I have to check the calculation of my students' grades. There's Blackboard and it does the calculations for me. I don't trust the system as far as I can throw it. So I end up having to effectively crunch the numbers in a spreadsheet. Now I have the same spreadsheet that I've used for the last, 5-6 semesters. Every time I go to do this, I end up like banging my head against the wall. And this is until I started doing the system where it's like, okay, I got to do what now? And when do I got to do it? And then how do I get the information into the spreadsheet? What does that formula look like? That's what you need the refresher for, because I don't do it every day, but I do it at the end of every semester, which means, yes, I should know it by now, but you've got other things going on in your mind. Like you don't necessarily have to remember all the steps here, but if you've got a list that shows you how to do it, it works for you. I used to joke about this it's kind of a little bit morbid. At RPI, we had to do COVID tests weekly, during the semester, PCR tests that were overseen by people. So you had to go to the facility, you had to wait in line, you had to do the test, and then they would tell you if you tested positive. Knock on wood, it never happened. My complaint every time I did it was there was no checklist. So it literally went down like you walk in, you say hi to the person, you take your mask off, you blow your nose, you sanitize your hands, they'd hand you a swab, you do the thing, you put your mask back on, you put the swab in the tube, you swirl it around, you dispose of the swab, you put the cap on, you put it in the thing, and you sanitize your hands again. Well, that's complicated. It took me the first month to figure out how to do this without being prompted. And all I kept saying is, why isn't there a checklist on the wall? Because everybody was doing the exact same thing every single time. But, I was coming from a lecture. My brain was never where it needed to be. And I would, without fail, try to skip a step at the beginning. And the guys were like, the nurses and the people who were watching you do this were always kind of looking at you like, you're a faculty, you should know better. And it's like, I'm not trying to be an idiot, but I could not remember how to do the thing because my brain was someplace else when I was going to do it. They just put a checklist on the wall. Yes, by the end of the semester, I could do it in my sleep, but those first few tests at the beginning of the semester were problematic. So you're not only doing it for yourself, you're doing it for others. But I still say, if we have to go back to this in the fall semester, God, I hope not. I want checklists because, yeah, I can do it now, but especially now if we've got incoming freshmen who are just doing it for the first time, it's going to be a nightmare for everybody involved. The last part is probably the best outcome from doing this. Like, why are you doing this? It allows you to think about how things could be done differently. Does it have to be done that way? Is there other steps that you should include that make things easier? Are there steps that you could get rid of that really wouldn't have any effect on the outcome? My least favorite phrase as an attorney, and especially as a junior attorney early on in my career, was, this is the way we've always done it. And as a junior associate, there was nothing I could do about that. You know, because I didn't know any better, which is fine. But, you know, it was kind of used as a cudgel. Like, there was always kind of beat over the head with it. Like, well, this is the way we've always done it. Like, don't think about doing it any other way. Well, when I started working for myself, that's like the one thing I wanted to kind of throw out the window, because I'm working for myself now. It shouldn't be the way it's always done. You know, if there could be a better way to do it, let's do it. I realized lawyers never try to work from scratch. They're always trying to work from something else. And there is a reliance on doing things the way you've always done them before. But sometimes it's not always the best way to do them. And kind of walking through this process identifies for you the possibility that there might be things you can do differently. Keep an open mind. So once you look at your workflow, you can start looking at solutions. And this is where the technology comes in. And this is kind of where a lot of times people throw their hands up and go, oh God, like, really? You know, it's working for me now. Can't we just keep doing this? And then some people kind of fall in the other category. Let's automate all the things, which, okay, don't necessarily need to go there either. There can be a happy medium. But until you know what that workflow is, you can't identify the steps that can be automated. So can things be automated? Some things can't. Just, you know, let that go. Is there software that does this thing? This is kind of where I've always fallen into. You know it can be done. Is there a way out there to have it, to do it for you, or do it better, or do it faster? Once again, not always the thing. A lot of times I've come up with ideas of ways to do stuff and it hasn't been created yet. And you're saying, well, get on that, will you? Well, yeah, in a perfect world, I would. But I am also not a coder. So a lot of times it's kind of like, well, if I could figure out a way to make it work, I could make lots of money. Do you just need reminders? Sometimes you just need the nudge to do the next thing. You don't necessarily have to automate anything, but having that kind of like, blinky light out there going, okay, now do this. It may be a series of, to-do reminders that keep you all set. In the matter management, for instance, a lot of my stuff is, now you got to do this. Now you got to do that. And those reminders are pretty much all I need to keep the project on course. This last one is something that I'm so guilty of. Beware of shiny object syndrome. It's really easy to fall down the rabbit hole of trying to find the perfect thing. Or is there a better thing? It's one of those things like squirrel. It's like, okay, I found something and it works for me, but there's always, is there something better out there? Let's go out and find it. Which is part of the reason why I have the consulting firm, because I was always looking for the best new thing. And because I was always looking for it, I knew about all the things. And then people were coming to me and going, do you know if there's a thing that can do X? Well, yes, there is. That being said, I kind of suffer from the whole, the shoemaker's children have no shoes concept. I've been on my own now for 11 years. For the first 7 years of it, I had no law practice management software. And when I tell people this, who know me now, they're like, that's horrifying. And I said, yeah, but here's the thing. I couldn't find the piece of software that did all the things that I wanted it to. I literally had kind of the opposite. Well, I wouldn't say the opposite of shiny objects. I kept looking at all the shiny objects, but they weren't the perfect shiny object. I am a transactional attorney who bills flat fee, who doesn't necessarily have to keep their time, for purposes of billing. There was a lot of kind of weird outlier stuff that I did. And at the time, a lot of law practice management software was built for litigation practices with staff who billed hourly and maintained trust accounting. Well, I don't do any of that stuff. So when I was looking at software, I was looking at all those pieces and going, well, I'm not going to pay for that. I'm not going to use that. So, that one was off, then you demo something else and you go, no, that's not going to work either. Cause 90% of that doesn't work for me. And this is a kind of an ongoing joke with the current company I'm using now. I'm actually a Clio user. And by the way, if anybody has any questions about Clio, feel free to reach out. I demoed Clio 5 times before I actually chose to use it. And I actually demoed it back at the beginning when it was literally like 2 guys in a computer. And one of those guys is the owner, like the founder, who is got a lot of money now. They're the biggest VC funded software company in Canada. So yeah, so I tell people this, I'm like, yeah, I demoed it back in the day when it was just Jack and a computer. But every time I demoed it, it was one of those things like, cool, but does it do X? And they're always like, no, not yet. And I'm like, okay, I'll see you later. And then I came back later and it did more things. And I'm like, cool, but does it do X? Another different X. And they go, no, not yet. And I'm like, cool, I'll see you later. But by like the 5th version of it, I was like, now it's doing most of the things that I want. But the problem here is you're still kind of looking for the unicorn. And even to this day, for a lot of my technology uses, I'm looking for the unicorn. It may not exist, but if it does, I've got a whole lot of that sucker for the rest of my life. But yeah, you're always kind of looking for the best new thing. And you can kind of get buried by it because you're always looking for the solution that may or may not exist. And it's time that could be better spent actually doing work. It's kind of a procrastination tactic in a lot of cases. But for those of you who fall into this trap, you know who you are, and I'm sorry. But it can be a good thing. You can automate the things, but you could also be like spending a lot of money and a lot of time on things that may not necessarily work for you. Your code, your very first code, write it down, put it on your hand, is M as in Mary, Mike, me, Mickey Mouse. I don't know. Your letter is M. Love it. Keep it. Do all the things. Okay, so let's get into some examples. How do you do what you're going to do here? Now that you've identified how things work, and I'm using an example that I use in my own practice that I ended up automating it because I had a fear that I was going to screw something up. So for me, I have a website. By the way, if you don't have a website and you're a solo or a small firm, get a website. Even if it's just one landing page, it does a world of good for everybody involved. For me, my website's a little more robust. And on that website, I have a contact form. The contact form is too, purposeful. One, to have people reach out. Have people reach out to me at all hours of the day and night. I'm always amazed when I wake up in the morning about how many times I get emails like in the middle of the night. Because to be fair, for some people, although not necessarily transactional work, people have thoughts, and those thoughts will wake them up, or they never went to bed, and they'll send you an email at 2:00 in the morning that they've had a revelation they want to do X. Okay, so they're going to email you right now because they know you're not awake, but if you could contact them in the morning, that'd be fantastic. Well, so now I've got this contact, and the contact comes to me via email. So I have an email that I need to do something with. What do I do with it? Well, for me, I have law practice management software now. So I wanted a way to get the contact information off of that email into my law practice management software without having to rekey it. This is where I say the fear comes in, because my concern was if I put the information into my law practice management software and I miskeyed something, fat fingered an email address, transcribed a phone number, your information is only as good as you can use it. So I wanted a way that the only failure point would be the person who actually entered the contact information on the website. and not me. Take me out of the equation. So I wanted the contact to be pulled into the database, so I could not only respond to the contact, but keep the details of what I talked to them about in one place and not on a bunch of Post-it notes, your legal pad from hell, all of those things where you tend to write stuff down and then like 3 days later, you're like, what was I trying to tell myself here? Everybody knows, if you're not that attorney, everybody knows that attorney who has like 9 million notes that only make sense to them. I wanted to have it kind of streamlined and have it all in one spot. And the way that I could do that is through automated software. I actually use the first one of these here, Zapier. Zapier is a connector between apps. It allows you to do both single actions and multi-step processes. I actually use a free version of Zapier to be able to do what I do. But I know plenty of attorneys who actually use paid plans, and you can make super complicated zaps. For me, the zap looks like this. When the email comes in, it actually attaches it not only sends it to my email address, but also sends it to what they call a dummy secondary email address, which in turn gets attached to the Clio software and creates a record. So I can go into Clio and type that person's name in, and it'll pull up the file that has been created based on that original contact information, which is great because here too, if you call the client back and they decide, yeah, they want to hire you, you're going to have to enter that information in some point. But if you already have the contact, it's just a matter of creating the file at that point, like create like what it is they want to do, how much you're going to bill them, and you're off to the races. It's also a really good way to track leads for me, because obviously not everybody's going to hire you, but you hope they do. Or they don't because you can't handle their problem. But I actually have their details regardless, which is cool because, you're doing conflict checks, or you should be doing conflict checks. And the easy way to do it is if you type their name into the system and it pops up and you go, oh, I've had contact with this person before. Why? Whether it was a web contact or something else, you've talked to this person probably at some point. You need to know that. You just need to know that for conflict purposes. So Zapier works really well for that for me. There are other systems out there that can also do this and do other kinds of automations as well. The next big one on the docket here is MS Power Automate. For those of you who work in the Microsoft 365 world, MS Power Automate is kind of a hidden skill. It's really good to work between their apps. Like if you're doing something in Outlook that you need to populate into something else, or Word to Excel, and you're doing it all the time, MS Power Automate allows you to do those kind of things easily. And a lot of these are what they call low code concepts, meaning that you don't have to be a coder to be able to make these connections work. But you can't be a complete Luddite either. So there's a balance here. MS Power Automate is harder to use than Zapier, to be fair, but it works really well in the Microsoft world. So if you're doing stuff with Outlook, take a look at Power Automate. It can be a bit of a lifesaver. I've actually used it for one task and one task only. When things come in via Outlook that have attachments, I actually have a file on the system that actually holds all those attachments. Now, you're going to say to yourself, what the hell's the point of that? The point of that is sometimes you end up deleting an email by mistake and you may not realize you've done it. I still have the attachments. I have to go find them, which, you're talking about, you end up just doing a random search on your laptop, but it has saved my bacon more than once, so I'm going to keep using it. I just got to remember every once in a while to go in and clean things up, because you'd be amazed how many attachments you get in a day. It's a lot. IFT, which is a short form for if then that, is a service that's been around for a long time. It's not as useful as it used to be, and I'm kind of sad about it because it used to be something I used a lot. And then they went to a subscription service plan and got rid of a lot of the utility of it. It effectively does things like Zapier and Power Automate, except for the fact that they are effectively made the little applets, like the hooks between the things, in advance. So you didn't have to code hardly anything. That's why IF was really kind of appealing, because you didn't have to, you just wanted to go, oh, yeah, I would like to do X and Z. Has somebody already created it? Hell yeah. Turn it on, you hook up the applications on either side of it. You effectively start up the what they call the webhook, which makes it work, and you're off to the races. It was really good with smart speakers, which is why I originally started using it. You can make your smart speakers do all kinds of weird crap. But I say over time, they lost the ability to connect to certain applications. And then they went to subscription service and made it so you pretty much had to pay to do almost anything. I think you can run 1 or 2 applets with them for free, but it's pretty limited. And then the last one's kind of an outlier, but it works really well. Zoho Creator, if you are in the Zoho universe, Zoho is all the things. They do CRM, some LPM, a lot of customer relations stuff. Is like kind of a different version of Salesforce. If you're familiar with that, Zoho also does accounting. So a lot of times that's where people kind of find their in with Zoho. But Zoho Creator is kind of the same kind of creature as Power Automate, that you can have Zoho things talk to each other. And their automations are really quite nice, but you got to be kind of working in that universe. The cool thing about Zapier is they just keep adding applications to it. So you'd be surprised a lot of time. And I've put stuff in there going, I wonder if this works. You can do a search to see if they have the ability to be able to work with that application. More often than not, they can. So back a few years ago, I went to a conference with a bunch of attorneys who are kind of on like the bleeding edge of technology. And I remember talking to a woman who had a family law practice, and she had like 10 Zaps to do her work. And at the time, I remember her talking about her process, and I was like, that sucker's a Frankenstein. It was so convoluted. And I said to her, I go, well, what happens if one of those breaks? And she goes, well, the guy will troubleshoot it. And at the time I was like, that's horrifying. Now I kind of understand the method behind her madness. Now she could probably do it with like half as many, because a lot of them are a lot more communicative to each other. But when you start using Zapier, it can kind of be addictive, and you're kind of like, well, I wonder if I could do this. You'll see here in a minute, I'll show you an example of some of the stuff that I've used it for. And it's, I kind of play around with it with this kind of a sandbox concept. Even on the free version, you have 100 Zaps a month. And you can use different email addresses to create up different accounts. So you can get like multi-hundred Zaps a month. Every time the process works, it uses a Zap. So kind of just keep that in mind if you start playing with it. So here's, like I said, the Zapier example, and this is taken from screenshots from the process. So you need a trigger and you need an action in Zapier. You can have multiple triggers and you can have multiple actions, but those are usually in the paid plan. Once you start getting the multi-step Zaps, they ask you to pay for it, but this is a free one. And this was something that I had kind of in my brain. I was like, I wonder if I can do this. So I spent probably way too much time in the afternoon trying to make this work. I wanted to have the ability to create a task in Asana, which is a planning software. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Planning software. So if something came into my head and I go, oh, I should have, I should do a task. I should set up a to-do for that. I didn't want to have to go in and open up Asana and type it in. I wanted to be able to talk to my smart speaker and make it happen. So yeah, I was lazy. All right. So I've got the speaker, and it does connect those two pieces of software, the Alexa. She's going to hate me during this entire part of the speech because I can't, every time I say something, she goes, what? And the creation of the task. So I had connected up the app. I decided the event should be a specific trigger phrase, which is kind of a built-in. It made you want to do that. And the trigger phrase was create to-do item. And then she would be asking me, you had an additional prompt question. What would you like to do? For those of you who use her, I'm not going to mention her by name because she gets upset. You know, this doesn't always work, but when it works, it's kind of cool. And once you said, what would you like to do? You're going to create a task in Asana. So you cook up the Asana task or the Asana app, and the event that's going to happen if all of this works is create a task. You have to hook up the account to the Asana, which for mine is my law firm's version. You have to identify if you've got multiple workspaces, which workspace you're going to use, which project you want to throw them in. So I just kind of picked kind of a catch-all so I could identify where they are and I can move them out afterwards. And then, the name, what would you like to do? That whatever you say there is going to end up in the task, and I'm automatically assigned to it. So it does work. I've made it work a couple times. My problem is, and I actually have to create a Post-it note, I can never remember the steps to make it happen, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of it. And that's on me. That's not on Zapier. But you see here that I've got to ask, her to effectively say, create a task in Asana, create a to-do item, and then tell her what it is I got to do. So if I could get this down to a science, I can just kind of talk into the universe and make this sort of thing happen. Once again, there's probably a better way to do this. I haven't figured out what it is yet. So, like I said, this can be dangerous because once you start figuring this out, you start going, well, can I do this? Can I do that? And how much time are you willing to throw at it? This one only took me 20 minutes and like 3 tries. So, but I've also been playing with it for a while. Does it work great? Is it probably faster to just open Asana and type it in? Certainly, but you got to do that. And I sometimes get bored. So there you go. Project boards. So a big thing with project management is the concept of a project board. And for those of you who ever have worked in a field other than law, you may be very familiar with this, whether it's advertising or engineering or something that has a standard process to it. A lot of times you may have seen this as a Post-it notes on a wall. Some people are big fans of that, where you're constantly putting things to do, done, in process on a series of Post-it notes, and you're moving them around on a wall. If it works for you, great. Once again, shiny object syndrome, you're thinking, there could be a better way to do this, especially if you are sharing it with people who are not on site with you. It's one thing to have everybody be able to walk into the conference room and look at all the Post-its. But if, half of your group isn't even on site, they're not going to be able to look at the Post-its unless you're taking pictures of them and sending them to them. There is software out there that does this and does this extremely well. There are things like Trello and Asana and Monday and ClickUp and Airtable. There are different versions of this kind of, pick your poison, so to speak. I have used both Trello and Asana. I just started dabbling with Monday. Monday is super robust. But once again, I don't have staff. So it's one of those things like the utility of sharing it with your colleagues is lost on me. But Asana kind of works for me as far as being able to try to figure out where things stand on certain projects. A lot of these, because they've been around a while, have templates, whether or not it's a template for a blog post or a template for, certain kind of to-do things. Chances are somebody out there has already created it. It's just a matter of finding it. And there are different versions of these kind of project boards. The big one is Kanban. So Kanban is kind of a system process. A lot of times that's kind of the post-it note concept where you've got different columns of categories of things to do and you kind of move from one to the other. The other ones that you might have been familiar with, depending on what previous careers you may have had, are StageGate and Gantt charts. Like I said, I work with an engineer as a spouse, and we go through, he's always talking about stage gates. But then he's also showed me some Gantt charts that are slightly horrifying. So I wanted to be able to kind of show you what they look like, because not, me talking about them doesn't exactly explain them. This is a Kanban example. This is taken from Trello. By the way, trying to pull down a version of this without showing you my entire law firm was problematic. So I actually kind of pulled down a template that isn't exactly what it is that I use, but can you kind of get the idea? This is more for a software designer. So you have things here, the backlog, things that should haven't been done yet. But for me, the major categories are to do, doing, and done. So you have whatever things are on your plate right now. If it's in process, you actually click and drag the card from one to the other. And when it gets done, you put it in the section to be done, and it actually shows when it got done. Now, for me, it's kind of a, it's kind of like checking off your to-dos on a piece of paper. For a bigger group, obviously, you'll get to see what's already been completed, so you're not like recreating work. And the nice thing is the template is you don't have to create a brand new one for every project. You can just copy and paste and start a new one. It has its utility. Some people really get off on this, but the concept of dragging and dropping only gets you so far. Another kind of version of the same thing is something called StageGate. And you see StageGate a lot more in engineering and software work, where you are effectively, these gates are stop points in a project. And you come up with an idea, you're brainstorming it, you're investigating the market, you're trying to kind of flesh out the project in advance. And you kind of have a stop point when you figure out whether or not it's a good idea. And then you go into the scoping phase where you kind of do, a SWOT analysis, identify the strengths and weaknesses associated with the project, and you stop there to see if you should go forward with it. And then you work into like the next phase where you build a business case for the project, feasibility studies, project definitions, and you stop there and see if it's still worthwhile. So it doesn't necessarily work super well for law firms, but depends on the kind of projects that you're doing. Some of them are much more lent to StageGate because you need to have everybody kind of come together and go, should we go forward with this? If you're in litigation, in like high stakes litigation, this actually might work for you, because that StageGate concept, when you're stopping and going, do we need to go forward with this, or do we settle this now? A lot of it seems to be kind of behind the scenes, but if you're kind of having kind of group meetings about the project going forward, that's effectively a StageGate. The last version that I wanted to show you is a Gantt chart. And for techie people, they eat it up with a spoon. Gantt charts are great for timeline-based projects, especially if you have hard deadlines, litigation. A lot of times you can actually visualize what's been done, what needs to be done, who's the lead on the project, who's accountable on the project, and what needs to be done and when. For me, I like it because it's a really good visualization of a calendar without looking at a giant calendar, and it breaks it down into steps that are easily understandable. Like I said, not all these are going to work for everybody, but when you kind of find what works for you, stick with it, because it makes your life a lot easier. So the concept here is, where do you want to go? So you've kind of come up with these processes, you've done these workflows, and now you want to see where it can take you in the future. So it's a matter of identifying in your work what it is that you want to go, where you want to take it. So for a lot of people, a lot of this may lead to better customer relationship management. If you are working in touch points with your clients, you may find that you want to be doing more robust customer relationship management. So you're having multiple touches with your clients. The easiest way to do that is to automate it. So, you bring in the client and you automate an email that goes out to collect information from them. Once you get that information from them, they may set an appointment. You do an automation that effectively reminds them of the appointment. So you're not having to have somebody call them up and say, oh, by the way, remember you have an appointment tomorrow. You sometimes see this in other fields, dentistry or hair salons, or, someplace where they're effectively doing it behind the scenes without making the phone calls. Dentists are probably a bad example because while I've seen a lot of them doing customer relationship management well, they tend to go overboard. So like the last dentist appointment that I had, they sent me an email reminder, and then they sent me a text reminder, and then they called me up and they sent me a postcard. It's like, really? Did I have to be reminded 4 times of this appointment? Obviously they have clients that do, but it's one of those things like you can go way too far with the customer relationship management. But like for me in the law firm field, sometimes you'll have a client that you meet with and you think it's a really good fit, and they're really eager to do something, but there's something holding them back. You want to be able to have yourself reminded that they haven't talked to you in 6 weeks, so that you can reach back out and see whether or not they want to go forward with the project. Those kind of people will drop off your radar if you're not careful. So customer relationship management is a great way to automate those touch points that those reminders are going out, if nothing else, to reconnect with the person and hopefully be able to get some business out of it. Drip marketing works the same way. Sometimes a lot of people think drip marketing is just, newsletters, and it certainly can be. But, you're building that database of your contacts, not necessarily for a, all person blast, but being able to reach out to individuals individually for reasons, whether it's not, might be tax season, or, a yearly filing, or there's something that is specific to their case that you want to be able to do without having to think about it. Because it's a good way to keep them, keep you in their minds as an attorney. Inter-office communications is a huge area, particularly now, with people off-site. A lot of times people just kind of say, well, we'll just use Slack or, Teams or whatever and be fine. But, like I showed you with the task lists, if somebody does a task, you can automate it so the message goes out that this is done, and may trigger somebody to do something else. There's a lot of automations in that particular space regarding handing things off to one another. Some places have what they call stand-ups, where they have a meeting every day for like 10 minutes, where they say where everybody is on certain projects and if there's anything holding them back. Those can be very, very successful. They also can be very, very annoying. There's a lot of ways you can do this via inter-office communication software without ever having to do those stand-ups. For me, the biggest one is to-do lists. To-do lists are the end-all be-all of my universe. They're also the bane of my existence. And for a lot of it, I want to be able to create a set of to-do lists for any given client. So I've gotten a long way on this. If you remember back to the LLC checklist, I actually have that built in now to my software. So when I create a client who's creating an LLC, I have a built-in task list and say, yes, they're creating an LLC, click. And what that means is the tasks are automatically included into my original task list, so that I know all the things that are attached to that client that need to get done. So it automatically populates that I need to find the name, I need to file the thing, I need to do the publication. Like all of those are automatically populated into a to-do list for me based on that client. You can get as many of these suckers as you want, because for me, like I do LLCs, but they also do PLLCs. PLLCs are completely different creatures on the front end. That's a completely different task list. So for those of you who do processes in practice that are definitely repeatable, this is kind of really where you can make things happen. And then timekeeping and invoicing. Like I said, the bane of existence for so many people. People hate keeping time. I understand that. And a lot of times it's one of those things like, oh crap, when did I start this? And you're trying to recreate it after the fact. There are automations out there, even using smart speakers, that will start and stop a timer for you. So you're actually effectively capturing time. I've seen even devices that you put on your desk that look like 20-sided dice, that you literally turn the thing on its side and the timer starts. And when you get done with that project, you turn it over again and the timer stops. And it uploads to a piece of software that tells you that you worked X amount of time on that one project. I don't do that sort of work, so I've never gone and bought that item. I've always thought it looked really cool. But for those of you who are in that space, timekeeping, unless you're keeping the time, you ain't getting paid. So same thing with the invoicing. For me, it's a series of literally clicks, 2 or 3 clicks, and I approve the thing and send it out. For some firms, it's a lot more complicated. So it's really important to kind of understand where you are and what you want to do. Now, probably the biggest thing you want to think about when you're entering the space, particularly in the software land, is to remember not everything works for everybody. It's really important to identify what you need and what you're trying to use it for before you go out there and seek out the product or seek out the software. For me, that's probably the biggest money and time saver there is, because the minute you start talking to a sales rep, because a lot of times, and you all know, when you go and look at software, the pricing is never on the website, which is a pain in the butt. A lot of the software that I mentioned on here, the pricing is actually visible, but like some of the larger pieces, definitely not. So you're going to end up doing a demo, and at some point in the process, they'll tell you a price. It's really important to kind of be able to stand your ground, to know what you need and what you don't. And if you've done the processes that I've talked about, you know that going in. Once you know that going in, it can save you a lot of time and energy in a demo, because if they start trying to sell you on things that you have no use for, and you know that, you can shut them down and you say, look, I need it to do X, Y, and Z. Does it do X, Y, and Z? If it's not, this call is kind of useless. Obviously, you can do it more polite than that. But they're going to try to wow you with stuff on a call. That's kind of their MO. If you know in advance that's not what you need, all the wowing in the world isn't going to change your mind about it, which is good, because you might be spending money you don't need, don't need to do. And the same thing too, you can kind of speed up the ask. You're like, how much does it cost? Like, I may be on the fence, but I need to know how much it is. Because a lot of times you may get half an hour into that call and you still don't know how much that costs. That product's going to cost you. And there's nothing worse than getting the ask at the end. It's particularly on a Zoom call, by the way. Hopefully your poker face is good. Where they give you the ask, they tell you how much it is, and you're trying not to like fall off your chair. Been there, done that. It's not fun. And then you start playing the game of, is it really that much money? So getting yourself ready for those kind of calls, because they're awkward for everybody. Unless you're into that sort of thing, it's awkward for a lot of people. You need to know in advance what it is you're looking for. So knowing that helps you out in a various number of ways. If nothing else, to know that you don't need that software. So we're coming up on time here a little bit. This is my contact information if you want to get a hold of me, either for the law firm or the consulting firm. Like I said, I've been doing this for a while. I'm always looking for the best new thing, even if it's even if it's painful for me. But I have, if I haven't seen it before, chances are it's brand new, but chances are I may have seen it before. So are there any additional questions from anybody? I've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat, but I really haven't seen anything come in. This is usually where I go, Bueller.
Sarah, I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you want to close on some words of advice, general advice to newly admitted attorneys as they break into the profession.
Certainly. So, like I said, I wasn't always a solo, but I've been a solo for a long time now. Even if you're not a solo and you're working as an associate, know that you don't need to do everything for everybody. And this is particularly true in the solo world. I am a business transactional attorney. I am not a family law attorney. I am not a criminal law attorney. There are a lot of things I do not do. And it's kind of hard. It can be hard, particularly when you're starting out, to stand your ground on this, because you are anxious and you want money to come in the door, and you think, well, I can learn how to do this. That only goes so far. And it's funny, I actually had a client call yesterday out of clear blue, and the client said to me potential client said to me on the phone, I liked your website because you didn't try to do all the things. And that was literally the first time I ever had a client say that to me. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah. He says, I go to these websites where it's like one or two people, and the laundry list of things that they do is insane. And he says, I will. Yeah. Do they do all of those things well? And I was like, I can't speak to other people, but I try to stay in my lane. So, don't think you have to do all the things. You don't have to do all the things. Find out what you're good at and stick with it. That's why you have referrals. You keep a bunch of your colleagues in your back pocket, so you know that you can send stuff to other people. I probably refer out as much work as I keep. And it's important because, yeah, I could do the traffic tickets. I could do the criminal appearances, but I know people who can do it better. And for my clients, it's a better outcome. If you're good with them, they will come back to you for what you're good at. Don't fear necessarily that you're going to lose the client. But at the same time, too, if you know you can't handle it, don't stress yourself out. Same thing, too, if you think you can handle it, but you're getting a bad feeling from the client when you're talking to them, know that you can say no. I hate when people, you think, oh, I got this, but there's something in the back of your brain, and you're like, damn, like what, like why? And it comes around and it will bite you, and it will bite you hard. It's kind of cliche to say trust your gut, but there's something to be said for it. If the client, what they refer to is, if the client's throwing red flags, step away. There's a reason why. Particularly in my world, like I can get a feeling about a transaction. Early on in my career, I was like, oh, that's not a big deal. It is a big deal, because if you've got a bad feeling at the beginning of it, it's not going to get any better. In fact, it's probably going to get worse. So kind of know yourself and know your skills. There's nothing saying you can't expand your practice later on. I've done it a number of times, but I also stay in my lane. And if I tell people, if I had $1 for every time I've said I am not a tax attorney, I wouldn't have to practice law. So that's more of a regret than advice. So how does that work for you, Kathy?
Great. And then if you want to mention, we have 1 minute, if you want to mention the young lawyer section and other sections and bar involvement, also to get that referral network going.
So I came in at the young lawyer section, that it was kind of the way I got to start with the bar association. You don't have to know what you want to be when you grow up and be part of the young lawyer section. We are everything from soup to nuts. I found my way into the business law section because I do business law. I found my way into the general practice section because I kind of do a bit of some other stuff too. I've gotten the referral network that I've needed for everybody. I have mentors, kind of unofficially, who I can call up at a moment's notice and ask the questions, and they know who I am and are happy to answer them for me. I think for me, that's the biggest part of bar association. It's not necessarily the, getting around and drinking, at social events, though that certainly is nice. But having that network there, especially as a solo, it can't be understated. So I hope this all worked for you people, and stay awake, drink some more coffee. We're just getting rolling here. So
great. And thank you again to Sarah Gold for being our opening segment on project management. We will take a short 15-minute break and we will get started with our next program topic. So again, a 15-minute break, and we will start back with our risk management program topic.